remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid
Yahoo! Yahoo!
U.S. officials not planning to meet Smotrich on visit amid uproar. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich's visit to Washington next week to speak at an Israel bonds conference was still scheduled to take place amidst outcry over his call to wipe out the Palestinian town of Huwara. But the White House said Thursday that government officials would not be meeting with him. From Al Jazeera, U.S. faces growing calls to deny entry to Israel's Bezalel Smotrich. The United States government is facing growing calls from advocacy groups, including Jewish American organizations, to impose a visa ban on a far-right Israeli minister who called for wiping out a Palestinian village. The U.S. Department of State had denounced Israeli Minister of Finance Bezalel Smotrich's comments on Wednesday, calling them repugnant and disgusting, but advocates have said verbal condemnation is not enough. Smotrich, an ultranationalist who also oversees civilian administration in the occupied West Bank, is set to speak at a conference in Washington, D.C. later in March, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported on Wednesday. I think the village of Huwara needs to be wiped out. I think the state of Israel should do it, Smotrich was quoted saying by Israeli media outlets after Israelis settlers ransacked the Palestinian town and burned down dozens of homes and cars. From here on, I'm probably going to substitute the term Israeli settlers with I'll substitute Zionist occupiers for Israeli settlers. Americans for Peace Now, a U.S. Jewish group that opposes the occupation, said Smotrich's comments were a call for a war crime and urged President Joe Biden to deny him entry into the U.S. The United States must be clear. The only thing that should be wiped out is his violent and hateful ideology. It's unacceptable abroad and it's unacceptable here, APN said in a letter to Biden that urged supporters to sign. Now Smotrich wants to bring his hatred to U.S. soil. He plans to travel to the United States later this month. We're here to say that he's not welcome. For its part, J Street, a Jewish American group that describes itself as pro-Israel and pro-peace, called on U.S. officials to shun Smotrich. Yes, but shunning Smotrich is not barring him from being in office or even condemning him. And shunning him is totally different. They should make clear that Smotrich's comments and actions are immensely damaging to the U.S.-Israel relationship, J Street said in the statement. It's an empty statement. Additionally, the administration should make clear that comments promoting grave violations of human rights, such as those made by Smotrich, are grounds for reexamination of a visa for entry to the United States. It's just grounds for reexamining it. We don't necessarily want to say that he's not allowed, but let's just re-examine it.
What is this nothing you talk about?
Asked about the calls to deny entry to Smotrich, Department of State spokesperson Ned Price told reporters on Thursday, "We don't speak to individual visa records nor as a general matter to a particular individual's eligibility for U.S. visa. Nevertheless, we'll continue to make clear that we reject the comments from the minister, just as we did yesterday." The occupiers' attack on Huwara had sparked international outrage against the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with many Palestinians saying that Israeli forces watched on and did not try to stop the rampage. Israel, accused of imposing a system of apartheid by leading human rights organizations like Amnesty International, receives at least $3.8 billion of U.S. aid annually. Washington has been increasingly critical of the policies of Netanyahu's far-right government, including the expansion of Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian land. However, the Biden administration regularly reasserts its ironclad commitment for Israel, ruling out practical measures to counter Israeli government policies. Progressive advocates and lawmakers have said Washington should impose conditions on its aid to Israel, but Biden has repeatedly dismissed the idea. Teruah, a rights group that represents hundreds of rabbis across the U.S., called on the Biden administration this week to revoke Smotrich's visa and urged American Jewish organizations to refuse to engage with him. Not only does his comment add to the pain of families and community members harmed by the violence in Huwara, it also adds to the increasing incitement from members of Netanyahu's new far-right extremist government. Teruah CEO Rabbi Jill Jacobs said in a statement. Adala Justice Project, a Palestinian-led U.S. advocacy group, encouraged supporters to sign on to a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, urging him to ban Smotrich from entering the country. The United States must ban the travel of Israel's Bezalel Smotrich to the United States in March 2023 because of his statements that call for violence and atrocities against the Palestinian people. The letter reads, describing the Israeli minister's comments against Huwara as a call for genocide. Democratic Senator Peter Welch said he shared a letter with Biden on Thursday urging the U.S. president to take a more active approach to push towards a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have a choice. Stand by passively as a withered two-state approach recedes into oblivion, or do our best to re-energize it with more assertive efforts to persuade the Netanyahu government to stop further expansion of settlements in the West Bank, to halt all de facto annexations, and to reaffirm Israel's commitment to a viable two-state solution, the senator wrote. Any hope for peace and prosperity in the region depends on the United States making the choice right now. And one of the narratives that I never hear is Israel could lose their state. It's possible that they could violate so many just like human standards that the international community would actively disallow them to have their state. This could happen. I mean, because majority of the right-wing people in Israel who consider themselves Israelis and consider themselves pro-Israel do not support a two-state solution. So the two-state solution is for people who are moderate in the United States and people who are pro-Israel that are in Palestine, that are Palestinians. That's what the two-state solution is used for. And from the MiddleEastEye.net, right groups urge U.S. to ban Israel Smotrich over call to wipe out Huwara.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Growing number of groups demand Israeli minister be sanctioned and barred from coming to the U.S. for incitement of genocide. A growing number of rights and advocacy groups are calling for the United States to issue an entry ban on Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich after he called for a Palestinian village to be wiped out earlier this week. In separate statements, a number of groups ranging from organizations focused on human rights in the Middle East to rabbinical groups in the U.S. have called for Washington to deny Smotrich a visa over his comments. Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn, on Wednesday called for both Smotrich's visa to be revoked and for him to face sanctions. The rights group stated that his comments could amount to incitement of genocide. The U.S. should immediately sanction Bezalel Smotrich for directly and brazenly encouraging mass violence against civilians, Adam Shapiro, Advocacy Director for Israel-Palestine at Dawn, said in a statement. The United States must not give the impression that it condones his hateful and violent ideology and policies, and anything less would make the Biden administration culpable in whatever violence comes next. The Adala Justice Project has started an online petition demanding Smotrich be banned from the U.S., and so far has received more than 3,000 signatures. A state representative calling for the burning of homes and killing of people should not have been given a platform to spread his racism, or should not be given a platform to spread his racism and incite more violence against Palestinians, Samaya Awad, communications director at the Adala Justice Project, told Middle East Eye. Awad added that the U.S. should also be pressured to ban groups from raising money for illegal settlements built on Palestinian land and whose occupants most recently set ablaze the Palestinian village of Huwara. When asked during a press briefing on Thursday whether the U.S. would issue such a ban, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said, "We don't speak to individual visa records, not as a general matter to particular individuals' eligibility for a U.S. visa." Price on Wednesday called Smotrich's remarks repugnant and disgusting and called for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to disavow the comments. It's time for Biden to end U.S. complicity in Israel's violent apartheid. Under no circumstances should Bezalel Smotrich be permitted to visit the U.S., Beth Miller, political director of Jewish Voice for Peace Action, told MEE. Rift between Israel and Jewish Americans. On Sunday, hundreds of Israeli settlers attacked Palestinian towns and villages near Nablus, following a shooting that killed 2 Israelis in the town of Huwara earlier that day. In the rampage on Huwara and other Palestinian villages, at least 1 Palestinian was killed and nearly 400 were wounded. Israel's police have arrested 10 people for suspected involvement in the attack, and we should call them Zionist occupying forces. They have arrested 10 people for suspected involvement. Before and after the mob violence took place, several Zionist politicians, including Smotrich, appeared to encourage or support the settlers' actions. Smotrich is expected to visit the U.S. later this month and will meet with the New York Zionist Bonds Organization. He does not have any meetings scheduled with the Biden administration, and 2 U.S. officials told Axios that even if he asked for meetings with Biden officials, he would not get them. In addition to rights groups and progressive Jewish organizations, some liberal Zionist groups, interesting, also condemned Smotrich's remarks and called for him to be denied entry. The pro-Israel group Americans for Peace Now is circulating its own petition urging Biden to deny Smotrich entry. Smotrich's comments are even more dangerous now that Israel's de jure annexation of the West Bank has made him effectively the governor of the territory with broad oversight over most of civil administration, said Rabbi Jill Jacobs, CEO of Teruah, a Jewish human rights group representing more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors in North America. And you see there, the CEO of Teruah itself does not represent Israel, does not represent Zionism. They make the choice not to. The CEO of Teruah is a Jewish human rights group, not an Israeli human rights group or a Zionist human rights group. Jacobs called on the Biden administration to decline any meetings with Smotrich if he's allowed into the country, and also urged U.S. Jewish groups to refuse to engage with him. The calls add to a growing rift between the broader Jewish American community and the Israeli government, headed by Netanyahu and a far-right coalition.